Now in chapter 9, we see the kindness of the kingdom in King David. And remember, I told you several lessons back when the compiler introduced us to the two men who were going to kill Ishbosheth, but he also introduced us to Mephibosheth. Well, that's where we are. King David's kindness to Mephibosheth is simply one example of King David's kindness to many people. Chapter 9, verse 1 says this: Then David said, Is there yet anyone left of the house of Saul, that I may show him kindness for Jonathan's sake? Now there was a servant of the house of Saul whose name was Ziba, and they called him to David. And the king said to him, Are you Ziba? And he said, I am your servant. And the king said, Is there not anyone of the house of Saul that I might show the kindness of God? And Ziba said to the king, There is still the son of Jonathan who is crippled in both feet. So the king said to him, Where is he? And Ziba said to the king, Behold, he is in the house of Machir, the son of Ammiel in Lodebar. Then King David sent and brought him from the house of Machir, the son of Ammiel from Lodebar. And Mephibosheth, the son of Jonathan, the son of Saul, came to David and fell on his face and prostrated himself. And David said to Mephibosheth, and he said, Here is your servant. And David said, Mephibosheth? And he said, Here is your servant. And David said to him, Do not fear, for I surely show kindness to you for the sake of your father Jonathan, and will restore to you all the land of your grandfather Saul, and you shall eat at my table regularly. And again he prostrated himself and said, What is your servant that you should regard a dead dog like me? Now Mephibosheth was only 5 years old when Jonathan was killed with King Saul at the Battle of Gilboa. And at least 10 years had passed by the time the compiler delivered chapter 7 and the birth of Solomon. So Solomon was born when David was 40 years old. And Solomon became the king at age 30 when David was 70 years old. Therefore, Mephibosheth was about 15 years old when Solomon was born. Now, after all the battles and with the surrounding nations, another set of years have passed, and we don't know exactly how long and how many years have passed. We've lost all of our sense of timing because these triumphs don't all seem to be quite in chronological order, and they say, well, after a long time and this and all that, and so we don't know exactly where we are. However, in the next passage, in verse 12, we're going to learn that at this point in the story, Mephibosheth must be married with a son by the name of Micah. But the question we still must ask is this: when was Micah born to Mephibosheth? Was he born to Mephibosheth before he arrived to live with David in Jerusalem, or was he born after? We simply do not know that answer. Nevertheless, Mephibosheth did not think very highly of himself, and he stated that to David. However, David was going to be kind to Mephibosheth because of his father, Jonathan. And so the compiler tells us what of David's direction to Ziba in verse number 9. Then the king called Saul's servant Ziba and said to him, All that belonged to Saul and to all his house I have given to your master's grandson. You and your sons and your servants shall cultivate the land for him, and you shall bring in the produce so that your master's grandson may have food. Nevertheless, Mephibosheth, your master's grandson, shall eat at my table regularly. And now Ziba had 15 sons and 20 servants. And then Ziba said to the king, According to all that my lord the king commands his servants, so your servant shall do. So Mephibosheth ate at David's table, as one of the king's sons. Mephibosheth had a young son whose name was Micah, and all who lived in the house of Ziba were servants of Mephibosheth. So Mephibosheth lived in Jerusalem, for he ate at the king's table regularly, and now he was lame in both feet. Okay. David has enlisted Ziba to care for the family allotment of land and the houses that once belonged to King Saul in Gibeah of Benjamin. And by the way, probably the house that David was let out the window belonged to Saul, because everything that belonged to Saul, including his daughter, were living there in Gibeah in King Saul's property. And by default, that property became Mephibosheth's after their deaths. Women and sisters were living on that land that needed to be taken care of, and David placed all that in the hands of Ziba. We would like to say that Ziba did well with that job. But when we arrive in chapter 16, we will learn that all was not well with Ziba and his caretaking of Mephibosheth's property. Nevertheless, Mephibosheth lived in Jerusalem, away from the family land, and he resided with David, just as if he was a son of David. Now, back in chapter 8, verse 12, the compiler mentioned that David had defeated the Ammonites, if you remember. Ammonites were related to the Israelites through Lot's son Ammon. Amorites, which I accidentally said, were Canaanite tribes. Now, we're talking here about David defeated the Ammonites and took spoils that he brought back to Israel. However, the story and details of that battle were not recorded in that passage back in chapter 8. And previous to the mention of Ammon, the compiler did mention Hadaezer, who will be mentioned in the next story passage that we are going to deal with. So the compiler is circling around in these stories. The compiler told the story of how David defeated Hadaezer, and now David did not kill Hadaezer. We learned that back then. And rather, he defeated him and his armies and put them under subscription. And it is my position that the compiler is now going to tell the story of how David defeated the Ammonites who had become the enemies of the kingdom. Thus, we will see Ammon and Aram also defeated. Chapter 10, verse number 1. Now it happened afterwards that the king of the Ammonites died, and Hanun, his son, became king in his place. Then David said, I will show kindness to Hanun, the son of Nahash, just as his father showed kindness to me. So David sent some of his servants to console him concerning his father. Here we come to the reason for this story being the defeat of Ammon mentioned in chapter 8, verse 12. Previous to the death of King Nahash of Ammon, the king and David were friends. So David probably did not defeat Nahash previously because they were friends, because Nahash had been friendly to David. Nahash was the dead king's name, and he had shown David this kindness in the past. And David wanted to return this kindness to Nahash's son. And indeed, David had not gone to war against his kind friend, and therefore it seems that David's trouble with his Ammonite cousins did not begin until Nahash was dead and his son Hanun came to the power of the throne. 1 Chronicles chapter 19, verses 1 and 2 agrees. Sometime after this, King Nahash of the Ammonites died, and his son Hanun became king. David said, I am going to show loyalty to Hanun because his father, Nahash, was always loyal to me. So David sent messengers to express sympathy to Hanun about his father's death. When David's servants arrive in the kingdom of Ammon, Hanun treats David's men as spies, and he tries to prove that they are enemies. Verse 2b. But when David's sons came to the land of the Amorites, the prince of the Ammonites said to Hanun their lord, "Do you think that David is honoring your father because he sent his consolers to you? Has David not sent his servants to you in order to search the city, to spy it out, and to overthrow it?" So Hanun took David's servants and shaved off half of their beards and cut off their garments in the middle as far as their hips and sent them away. Again, 1 Chronicles chapter 19, 2b through 4, verse 4 agrees. But when David's ambassadors arrived in the land of Ammon, the Ammonite commanders said to Hunan, "Do you really think these men are coming here to honor your father? No. David has sent them to spy out the land so they can come in and conquer it." So Hunan seized David's ambassadors and shaved them, cut off their robes at their buttocks, and sent them back to David in shame. Now for the men of that part of the world, the beard was the mark of being a free man. Cutting off one side of the beard was an absolute insult that reduced the men to the status of slaves. Since Israel was not allowed to have slaves, it was really an insult that lasted until those beards grew out. And in addition, to cut a man's robe off at his waist to show that which was below was a vile and detestable affront to Israel. Hunan's action was an outright request for the beginning of a war with Israel. What would David's men do? They were insulted with half a beard and vile clothing. David told them to stay in Jericho. So they had made it across the Jordan River and they'd gone to Jericho. Verse number 5. When they told it to David, he sent to meet them, for the men were greatly humiliated. And the king said, "Stay at Jericho until your beards grow, and then return." Verse 5 in 1 Chronicles 19 says the same. When David heard what had happened to the men, he sent messengers to tell them, "Stay at Jericho until your beards grow out, and then come back," for they felt deep shame because of their appearance. David felt for his insulted men. And he also understood that these men were highly insulted by the actions of their cousins, the Ammonites. And David's heartfelt desire for his men, and he wanted them to remain in Jericho until their beards grew and they had new clothing before they returned to Jerusalem. David did not want his people to see them in such a shameful appearance. David did not wait for his men to grow their beards, though, and he did not wait for them to arrive with the new clothing. David assembled an army. This was fighting words to David. What the Ammonites had done was fighting terms to David, and David's army was assembled, and the Ammonites realized that they had stirred the anger of David in verse number 6. Now when the sons of Ammon saw that they had become odious to David, the sons of Ammon sent and hired the Arameans of Beth-rehob and the Arameans of Zobah, 20,000 foot soldiers, and the king of Maacah with 1,000 men, and the men of Tob with 12,000 men. And when David heard of it, he sent Joab and all the army, the mighty men. The sons of Ammon came out and drew up in battle array at the entrance of the city, while the Arameans of Zobah and of Rehob and the men of Tob and Maacah were by themselves in the field. Now 1 Chronicles 19:6 through 7 actually agrees with this. When the people of Ammon realized how seriously they had angered David, Hunan and the Ammonites sent 75,000 pounds of silver to hire chariots and charioteers from Aram Naharaim and Aram Maacah and Zobah. They also hired 32,000 chariots and secured the support of the king of Maacah and his army. These forces camped at Medeba, where they were joined by the Ammonite troops that Hunan had recruited from his own towns. Hunan had enlisted the help of the Aramanites, Aram is Syria, whom David had already defeated and put under subjection to Israel. And when they arrived, they would come up behind the army of Israel, while Hunan would fight Israel from their front steps of their porch of their city, at their gates. Now David's plan was in the hands of his commander Joab. So we hear what Joab decided in verse number 9. Now when Joab saw that the battle was set against him in front and in the rear, he selected from all the choice men of Israel and arrayed them against the Arameans. But the remainder of the people he placed in the hands of Abishai his brother, and he arrayed them against the sons of Ammon. He said, "If the Arameans are too strong for me, then you shall help me. But if the sons of Ammon are too strong for you, then I will come to help you. Be strong, and let us show ourselves courageous for the sake of our people and for the cities of our God, and may the Lord do what is good in his sight." So Joab and the people who were with him drew near to the battle against the Arameans, and they fled before him. And when the sons of Ammon saw that the Arameans fled, they also fled before Abishai and entered the city. Then Joab returned from fighting against the sons of Ammon, and he came to Jerusalem. Actually, 1 Chronicles 10 through 15 agrees. When Joab saw that he would have to fight on both the front and the rear, he chose some of Israelites' elite troops and placed them under his personal command to fight the Arameans in the fields. He left the rest of the army under the command of his brother Abishai, who was to attack the Ammonites. "And if the Arameans were too strong for me, then come over and help me," Joab told his brother. "And if the Ammonites are too strong for you, I will help you. Be courageous. Let us fight bravely for our people and the cities of our God. May the Lord's will be done." When Joab and his troops attacked, the Arameans began to run away. And when the Ammonites saw the Arameans running, they also ran from Abishai and retreated into the city. Then Joab returned to Jerusalem. Joab's plan worked for David. Israel was victorious. The Aramites and the Ammonites ran for their lives in fear of the armies of Israel. But that does not mean that the battle is over. The Aramites did not want to surrender to Israel. The compiler tells us their next step, and he does this in chapter 10, verse 16. The Arameans now realized that they were no match for Israel, so they sent messengers and summoned additional Aramean troops from the other side of the Euphrates River. These troops were under the command of Shobach, the commander of Hadaezzar's forces. And when David heard what was happening, he mobilized all Israel across the Jordan River and positioned his troops in battle formation. Then David engaged the Arameans in battle, and they fought against him. But again the Arameans fled from the Israelites. This time, David's forces killed 7,000 charioteers and 40,000 foot soldiers, including Shobach, the commander of their army. When Hadaezzar's allies saw that they had been defeated by Israel, they surrendered to David and became his subjects. After that, the Arameans were no longer willing to help the Ammonites. 1 Chronicles 19, 15 through 19 agrees. When the Arameans saw that they had been defeated by Israel, they gathered themselves together, and Hadaezzar sent and brought out the Arameans who were beyond the river, that's the river Euphrates, and they came to Helam, and Shobach, the commander of the army of Hadaezzar, led them. And now when it was told David, he gathered all of Israel together, and they crossed over the Jordan River, and they came to Helam. And the Arameans arrayed themselves to meet David and fought against him. But the Arameans fled before Israel, and David killed 700 charioteers of the Arameans and 40,000 horsemen, and struck down Shobach, the commander of their army, and he died there. When all the king's servants of Hadaezer saw that they were defeated by Israel, they made peace with Israel and served them. So the Arameans feared to help the sons of Ammon anymore. David had now defeated Hadaezer twice and brought him into servitude to Israel. Also Shobach, he died with his men. And you will notice a difference in the numbers of charioteers that David killed. Samuel says 7,000, Chronicles says 700. You will also see that in Samuel it was 40,000 foot soldiers, and in Chronicles it was 40,000 horsemen. Well, it was one or the other in either case. To make matters more difficult, the Syriac Old Testament says it was 700 chariots and 4,000 cavalry. 3 different sets of numbers. So here is where the trouble lies. The Hebrew language and the Syriac language have no numbers in their to deal with. Their numbers are their vocabulary, and every letter has a value. And each letter in their alphabet represents a numerical value. Therefore, a set of letters in either language could represent a number based on the context of the sentence. Well, with that, we don't know the answer to why these numbers are out of line. But what does it matter? Israel won.